The traditional image of the United States has always been built on a seductive contrast. On one side, skyscrapers that shine like beacons of promise. On the other, the narrative of individual effort capable of transforming any destiny. But, observing the country closely, this facade begins to crack silently, revealing a portrait that few were prepared to face. In makeshift warehouses, parking lots, and community centers, the new face of the working class is forming in long, silent lines, not to seize opportunities, but to receive bags of food to ensure dinner. These are men and women who for decades believed that discipline, consistency, and hard work would be enough to ensure dignity. Today, many of them can barely balance basic expenses, as if an invisible predator had advanced on their wages, slowly swallowing everything that once built a sense of stability. In the weary expressions of these workers, one perceives not only physical exhaustion, but an emotional wound that exposes the fragility of a system that, for generations, guaranteed belonging and hope. The official narrative still speaks of growth, economic robustness, and continued prosperity, but none of these discourses appear in the eyes of those who spend the entire night in line at a food bank, fearing that this month their pantry won't last until the end of the week. The contradiction is brutally imposed. The richest country in the world coexists with employed citizens who depend on charity to survive. And this is where the most uncomfortable question arises, silent but inevitable. What has changed so profoundly in the American structure that hunger has once again become part of the daily lives of those who have always sustained this country? Before we move on to the next part of this investigation, please subscribe to the channel and leave a like. This strengthens our work and helps this documentary reach more people who also need to see what is really happening behind the image of the United States. Let's continue. Over the past 2 decades, the reality of the American working class has undergone such a profound transformation that it can no longer be described as a passing crisis, but rather as a structural change that strikes at the very core of millions of families. In cities that once vibrated with the constant sound of operating factories and trucks entering and leaving industrial warehouses, today what we see are empty warehouses, abandoned parking lots, and streets marked by a silence that was never part of the economic identity of the United States. Workers who always relied on the stability of their jobs now find themselves forced to balance 2, sometimes 3, simultaneous jobs in a desperate attempt to avoid eviction, pay for health insurance, or simply keep basic food on the table. Even so, despite extended hours and increasing physical strain, a growing portion of this population is finding that their monthly salary no longer covers the minimum cost of living. This disruption becomes even more visible in food banks, which have ceased to serve only vulnerable groups and now receive entire families daily who never imagined needing this type of assistance. Cars arrive in long lines, often before dawn, and inside are uniformed workers who have come straight from their night shift to pick up food, avoiding the embarrassment of being seen by colleagues or neighbors. The scene is repeated in urban centers, middle-class suburbs, and small rural towns, revealing that the phenomenon is no longer restricted to pockets of poverty. It spreads like a continuous shadow over all regions of the country. The psychological impact is undeniable, because for a culture that for decades has relied on the pride of the self-made worker, depending on help to eat is more than an economic sign. It is a wound to collective identity. The outward appearance of these communities may still suggest normalcy, but one only needs to observe the daily routine to realize that American life hangs by increasingly fragile threads, held together by people who carry the country on their shoulders, while the country, in return, offers only the distant promise of a future that never arrives. Faced with this growing scenario of instability, a disturbing question arises that few dare to confront. If these are the visible symptoms, what is really hidden behind this silent collapse that advances unannounced? Behind the visible landscape of ever longer lines at food banks and exhausting workdays that no longer guarantee the basics, there is an underground machine that operates constantly, silently, and with perfect calculation, shaping the lives of the American working class without them realizing the true size of the structure that oppresses them. For decades, while news outlets celebrated growth rates and technological advances, a gradual process took place far from the eyes of the population. Companies migrated their operations to countries where the cost of labor is drastically lower, automated entire sectors with machines cheaper and faster than any employee, and began to concentrate profits in corporate layers, increasingly distant from the daily reality of those who produce. The result of this dynamic does not appear all at once. It infiltrates small changes, a benefit cut here, a denied readjustment there, an increase in rent soon after, until life begins to crumble with the naturalness of something inevitable. At the same time, the cost of living escalated at a much faster rate than wages, creating a chasm that deepens year after year. Housing, health, transportation, and food have become goods that demand an increasingly larger share of the budget, leaving millions of workers without any margin for unforeseen events, emergencies, or minimal stability. And while this was happening, the financial system expanded credit conditions, encouraging families to take on debt not for luxuries, but to meet basic needs, creating a permanent dependence on loans, credit cards, financing, and interest that accumulate like invisible chains. Successive governments contributed to this scenario by offering massive tax incentives to large corporations, while simultaneously reducing investments in essential public services, further burdening those who were already vulnerable. The idea that the economy prospers from the top down maintained unshakable structures for decades, even when data and personal experiences already demonstrated that prosperity did not reach the workers, only the top of the pyramid. The country continued to celebrate numbers while ignoring lives. It is at this point that the collapse ceases to be an accident and becomes the logical consequence of choices made over many years, choices that did not include the people who today stand in line to get food. And if all this already seems serious, what happens when this system, built on precariousness and increasing dependence, finally loses its ability to sustain itself? The next chapter reveals the impact of this mechanism when it reaches its breaking point. When this silent mechanism advances without any sign of retreat, the consequences cease to be distant predictions and begin to tangibly shape the daily lives of millions of Americans who now live in a permanent state of adaptation. Small towns once sustained by local factories, distribution centers, or retail networks are progressively declining, creating entire corridors of empty storefronts, deserted streets, and neighborhoods that lose vitality as families abandon their homes in search of regions where the cost of living still offers some chance of survival. Internal migration, once motivated by opportunity, now occurs out of necessity, displacing entire families who are forced to leave behind jobs, roots, and community ties accumulated over years. In large urban centers, the impact takes on even harsher dimensions because the cost of living has become an uninterrupted escalation that transforms rent into an almost unsustainable burden, absorbing a large part of income and reducing the margin for any other type of stability. The economic pressure transforms into emotional tension that accompanies workers in all areas, many of whom live with the constant fear of losing their jobs, becoming ill without assistance, or facing emergencies that completely disrupt the family budget. As these effects deepen, entire neighborhoods begin to experience visible deterioration, increased violence, reduced essential services, and the emptying of social structures that sustained community life. And it is precisely in this scenario that the inevitable question arises: how does this constant pressure begin to penetrate not only the finances, but also the emotional core of those living in this new America? Behind the economic deterioration spreading across the country lies a less visible yet far more profound consequence that redefines the daily experience of the working class: the emergence of an emotional void that settles in slowly, steadily, and almost irreversibly. In an environment where the cost of living rises faster than any expectation of stability, workers begin to live under the permanent feeling that they are always behind schedule, always tired, always trying to reach something that seems to slip further away each year. This continuous exhaustion produces an inner silence that is difficult to measure, but easy to perceive in the eyes of those who work long shifts, return to empty homes, and find less and less time for companionship, rest, or meaningful connections. Large metropolises, once seen as spaces of opportunity, have transformed into places where haste dominates the streets and loneliness seeps into apartments illuminated by screens and electronic devices that promise connection but deliver only a sophisticated form of isolation. Community life, which for decades served as an emotional foundation for many families, is disappearing at a pace as rapid as the closure of small businesses, and with it vanishes the sense of belonging that kept people anchored to something greater than work. Today, even those who fulfill their obligations and try to maintain their routine realize that something essential has been lost: the peace of mind of knowing that daily effort is building a possible future. The economic collapse, therefore, is not only material, it is also psychological. Millions live surrounded by symbolic abundance, supermarkets overflowing, brightly lit shop windows, advertisements of prosperity, but face internally the feeling that none of this truly belongs to them. This contradiction generates a kind of emptiness that doesn't manifest itself in statistics, but spreads throughout entire neighborhoods, creating the impression that the country is experiencing a silent extinguishing of hope. It's the kind of transformation that doesn't happen overnight, but which, when perceived, is already deeply ingrained. And as this emotional silence expands, so does the need to understand something even more disturbing: the numbers that reveal the true extent of this new era of dependency and precariousness, numbers that rarely reach the public with the transparency they deserve. Want to see what's really behind this reality? The scale of the collapse affecting the American working class becomes even clearer when viewed through data that, although public, rarely receives the attention necessary to reveal the true extent of the crisis. Across the country, food banks are registering successive increases in demand, reaching levels that, in many states, surpass those of the Great Depression. Millions of families depend on food assistance to supplement what their wages no longer cover, and among them are full-time workers, young adults newly entering the workforce, and elderly people who contributed for decades to the social security system but now face the insecurity of an insufficient pension. These numbers, when analyzed together, show a society teetering on the brink of collapse. Personal debt, in turn, has reached historic levels. Credit cards accumulate interest that erodes monthly budgets, financing extends for decades, and student loans trap entire generations before they even have the opportunity to build any stability. In states where the cost of housing has skyrocketed, more than a third of the population allocates almost half of their income to rent, alone creating a structure in which simple, unforeseen events, such as car trouble or a doctor's appointment, can push entire families into poverty overnight. Financial instability is no longer the exception, but the rule, and with it grows the number of people living in cars, trailers, or temporary shelters, a phenomenon that silently advances along the outskirts of cities. At the same time, the American social safety net is proving incapable of keeping pace with the rapid collapse. Programs that should offer minimal security are operating at their limit, unable to cope with the growing demand, while millions of workers spend hours in lines, crowded websites, and endless bureaucracy to access benefits that often never arrive. These are numbers that not only describe a crisis, but reveal its depth. If this data is already enough to reveal the gravity of the situation, what can we expect from the future when this already saturated structure reaches a point where it can no longer sustain even its own base? In the next chapter, this horizon becomes even more unsettling. As the economic and emotional structure of the American working class fragments, the country begins to project a future that, until recently, seemed unthinkable for the world's greatest power. If the present is already marked by food lines, multiple jobs, and a collective sense of fragility, what is emerging on the horizon is an even more severe scenario, in which precariousness ceases to be an isolated phenomenon and becomes a permanent feature of daily life. Entire municipalities threaten administrative collapse, unable to sustain schools, hospitals, and basic services in the face of reduced revenue and a vertiginous increase in social demand. In densely populated neighborhoods, dependence on welfare programs is growing at such an accelerated pace that experts are already warning of the risk of complete saturation, creating an overload impossible to manage in the long term. Inequality, which advances like a silent corridor between classes, is beginning to create deep fissures in social cohesion. On one side, small groups concentrate enough wealth to weather successive crises without altering their habits. On the other, millions of workers live on a thin line, separating apparent stability from immediate ruin. This imbalance tends to provoke political tensions, extreme polarizations, and massive displacements within the American territory itself, as families seek regions with a lower cost of living, even if it means abandoning their roots and starting over from scratch. The idea of upward mobility, once so present in national identity, gives way to a mechanism of pure survival, in which every decision boils down to keeping food on the table and minimum bills paid. The risk, therefore, is not merely economic, it is structural. A country that allows its essential workers, the same ones who keep hospitals running, deliver food, maintain roads, clean streets, and operate national logistics, to fall into chronic poverty, compromises not only its present but its very ability to sustain the future. When the productive engine falters, the entire system is thrown into turmoil. Faced with this unsettling scenario, one question continues to echo among the social and emotional ruins of the new America. If collapse is already underway, what remains to be understood about what is truly lost when a nation ceases to care for the people who sustain it? When one observes the current state of the American working class, it becomes evident that the collapse manifests itself not only in the inability to pay bills or the increasing dependence on food assistance, but above all, in the silent erosion accumulating in the collective consciousness of a country that, for decades, built its identity on the promise that individual effort would be enough to guarantee dignity. This promise, repeated for generations, is crumbling in the face of a reality that reveals a country incapable of offering minimal security to those who sustained it, with exhausting workdays, personal sacrifices, and unwavering faith in the possibility of upward mobility. What is crumbling now is not only the myth of the tireless worker, but the very emotional structure that kept millions believing in the existence of a rewarding horizon. The decay spreading through urban centers, suburbs, and small towns is not merely the result of negative statistics. It stems from the intimate experience of people who, after decades of contribution, watch their lives shrink in the face of rising living costs, food insecurity, and the persistent feeling that they no longer belong to the country they helped build. There is a symbolic emptiness that no immediate policy can repair, because it is linked to a profound perception of abandonment, a kind of social wound that slowly opens and transforms hope into a distant memory. It is this void, more than material poverty, that defines the new America, a nation where work has lost its meaning and where survival has replaced any idea of a life project. This observation opens the door to an inevitable reflection. If even the workers who for decades sustained the functioning of the country are now in the food line, what kind of future awaits those who come after them? The question remains unanswered, echoing in the silent streets, the crowded supermarkets, and the assistance lines that grow longer each month, reminding us that the real collapse doesn't begin when the money runs out, but when the sense of belonging crumbles before the eyes of an exhausted population. If you believe that these truths need to be discussed without filters, and that understanding what is happening is essential to seeing the way forward, subscribe to the channel now and stay tuned for our upcoming documentaries. Here, reality isn't hidden, it's revealed.